Title: The Forgotten Channel. Chapter 1: A Forgotten Broadcast. Emma Parker felt a shiver run down her spine as she sat in her cramped office, reading a series of online forum posts that had surfaced over the last month. They were part of a thread on a paranormal message board titled simply Candle Cove. Initially, she hadn't paid it much attention. Lost media cases of bizarre television shows weren't uncommon, especially in online horror circles. But something about Candle Cove felt different. Something about the way people described it seemed to leave an uncomfortable, lingering dread in her mind. And this wasn't some elaborate story crafted by anonymous users. These were testimonials, memories, fragile, fragmented accounts of something real. The first post was from a user named Maritime13, who asked if anyone remembered a children's show called Candle Cove that allegedly aired in the 1970s. He described it as a show about a young girl named Janice, who had adventures on a pirate ship, captained by a puppet named Pirate Percy. But as he wrote, he seemed to drift into unease, describing how disturbing the episodes became over time. He recalled an unsettling character named the Skin Taker, who wore a cloak made of children's skin, his jaw jerking unnaturally as he spoke. Emma took a slow breath, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. She could imagine it, this grotesque puppet with hollow eyes and that jittering mouth. She scrolled further down, past a few posts where users chimed in with vague memories of the show, each one recalling details that seemed to echo through her mind, as if awakening a half-formed memory that was somehow her own. User Sky Shadows remembered an episode where Pirate Percy was lost at sea, floating alone on a dark ocean while eerie, wailing music played in the background. Another user mentioned an episode where Janice ran through a foggy forest, pursued by the Skin Taker, his mouth snapping open and shut like a mechanical toy. The eerie tone of the show, the ominous puppetry, the distorted voices. It all seemed out of place for a children's show. Yet each person's memory grew stranger, darker, each recounting more fragmented than the last. Emma leaned back in her chair, her hands clammy as she rubbed her temples. She'd watched a fair share of horror as a kid, shows that pushed the boundaries of children's programming, but Candle Cove seemed to stand apart. It was almost as if the show had actively set out to traumatize its young audience, not entertain them. But what struck her most was a post by Aisling G. Unlike the others, her tone wasn't wistful or nostalgic. It was afraid. I'm sure this sounds insane, but I remember being obsessed with Candle Cove when I was little. But it was off. I remember asking my mum about it when I was older, and she looked at me like I was crazy. She said that every time I asked to watch Candle Cove, I would sit in front of the TV for hours, staring at static. I never heard any voices, never saw any pirates or Janice or Percy, just static. But I remember it so clearly. I could swear I saw them. What was that show? Emma felt her heart pound as she read the post again. Static. The other users shared vague memories of episodes, scenes, characters. But what if none of it had actually aired? What if the show had existed somewhere outside the realm of traditional television? A chill settled over her as she pondered the implications. The mystery was too tempting to ignore. She decided to dig deeper, to look for traces of Candle Cove in historical records. It could be her next big story, a deep dive into lost media, urban legends, and the collective memories of haunted viewers. And maybe she could unearth a little truth. By the next morning, Emma was well down the rabbit hole, her desk littered with notes and articles. She'd found several mentions of Candle Cove on different websites, each reference more disturbing than the last. The show was supposedly aired only in one small town, Ironton, in 1971. She found newspaper archives, scanned copies of old TV listings, but there was nothing, no official record of Candle Cove ever existing. Emma decided to go to Ironton. She called her editor and managed to get a small budget approved, pitching the story as a mix of local mystery and investigative reporting. By noon, she had packed her bags and set off on the road. Emma arrived in Ironton as dusk settled over the town. It was smaller than she'd expected. A place seemingly frozen in time, with brick buildings and fading storefronts. It looked like the kind of town that had barely changed since the 1970s. The kind of place where people still knew each other by name, where stories were told and retold until they became part of the town's fabric. Her first stop was the public library, hoping to find old TV listings or local records. She was met by an elderly librarian named Mrs. Jenkins, who seemed pleased to have a visitor. "Candle Cove, you say?" Mrs. Jenkins adjusted her glasses, a glint of recognition in her eyes. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time." Emma felt a surge of excitement. "You remember it?" Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, her gaze shifting. "I don't know if remember is the right word. It's like a ghost in the back of my mind. I have memories of it, yes, but they're strange. I can't be certain they're real." Emma leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What do you remember?" The librarian took a deep breath, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I remember sitting my daughter in front of the television, and she'd stare at it for hours. The strange thing was, I could swear there was nothing on, just static. But my daughter, she would laugh, talk as if she were watching something." Mrs. Jenkins' voice grew softer, her eyes haunted. "She would talk about pirates and a puppet with a horrible grin, a grin that never moved right, and I thought it was just her imagination." A shiver ran through Emma. This was almost exactly what the forum user had described. She pressed further. "Did anyone else see it? Was it something the whole town remembers?" Mrs. Jenkins shook her head slowly. "Some of us. A few parents. We talked about it at the time. There were other kids who watched it too. Other parents who noticed strange things. But it was as if the memories just slipped away over time. Some nights, I wonder if we dreamed it all up." Emma jotted down notes, feeling a strange chill settle over her. "Do you know if there are any archives or tapes left?" The librarian shook her head. "As far as I know, no recordings exist. It was almost like the show never existed at all. If you didn't see it with your own eyes, you'd never know it was there." Emma thanked Mrs. Jenkins and left the library, her mind reeling. The show was becoming more like a phantom, a shared nightmare that had left traces in people's memories, but no evidence of its existence. As night fell, Emma checked into a small motel and found herself haunted by the stories she had heard. She drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with flashes of dark images. A pirate ship floating on black waves, a young girl running through a fog-filled forest, a puppet with empty eyes and a wide, grotesque grin. She awoke with a start in the middle of the night, her heart pounding. The room was silent, and for a moment, she felt the strange, unshakable feeling that she wasn't alone. She sat up, reaching for the lamp, her hands shaking as the faint sound of static filled the room. She froze, every nerve in her body tense. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the static stopped. The room fell silent, the only sound her own breathing, shallow and quick. She lay back down, feeling a chill settle over her as she stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing. Had it been a dream? Or had the show somehow followed her here, slipping through the cracks of memory and imagination? She couldn't shake the feeling that Candle Cove was watching her, waiting, drawing her deeper into its twisted, nightmarish world. The next morning, Emma decided to explore the town further. She found a small diner where she overheard locals talking about the show, speaking in hushed tones, their faces clouded with the same unease she had felt all night. She spoke to a man named Cal, who had been a child in Ironton during the 1970s. Cal's face darkened as he described his memories of Candle Cove. "There was an episode," he whispered, his voice thick with dread. "An episode where the characters just screamed. It went on, minutes of just them staring at the screen, screaming, and we couldn't turn it off. It felt like they were screaming for us." Emma's heart pounded as Cal described it, each word pulling her further into a world that felt half imagined, half real. She knew she was close, that she was brushing up against something dark and inexplicable, a force that had slipped through the edges of reality. Candle Cove, she thought. What are you? As Emma walked back to her motel that evening, she noticed a faint, almost imperceptible whisper in the wind. a childlike voice calling her name. She froze, turning slowly, but there was nothing there. The street was empty, the town silent. But as she continued, she heard it again, a soft, echoing voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Emma, come play with us." It was the voice of a young girl, haunting, filled with an eerie, childlike sweetness. She hurried her pace, her mind racing, a deep-seated fear taking root in her heart. She didn't look back, afraid of what she might see. As she reached her motel room, Emma shut the door behind her, locking it with shaking hands. She sat on the edge of her bed, breathing heavily, trying to calm the frantic beat of her heart. And that night, as she lay in bed, the darkness seemed to close in around her, thick and suffocating, as though the very walls were watching, waiting. The investigation had only just begun, but Emma sensed that Candle Cove was already pulling her into a world where nightmares and reality blurred, and where the voices of long-forgotten children echoed through the shadows. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Past. Emma couldn't shake the haunting feeling that had settled over her since arriving in Ironton. The town felt trapped in a strange, timeless silence, as if the past lay just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface. Candle Cove wasn't just a rumor here, it was a ghost, a shadow lingering in the memories of those who had been unlucky enough to watch it. The morning after her unsettling conversation with Cal, Emma took her coffee to a park bench near the town square, her gaze drifting over the quiet streets. She saw a few residents walk by, glancing at her with curious, wary expressions, as if her presence stirred something they preferred to leave undisturbed. She felt almost like an intruder, trespassing on a collective memory that no one wanted to recall. Yet, she was determined to uncover the truth. There was something about Candle Cove that called to her, a mystery that ran deeper than a mere urban legend. It was as if the show itself had reached out to her, pulling her into its dark orbit. Emma began her day by returning to the library, hoping to dig up any further records or local accounts of the mysterious show. She greeted Mrs. Jenkins, the librarian, and the woman looked at her with a wary expression, as though sensing Emma's resolve had only grown overnight. "I don't think you're going to find any physical records of Candle Cove, my dear," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice low, her gaze flickering nervously toward the empty aisles, as if fearing they weren't alone. "I've looked myself years ago, after my daughter started speaking about the show. There's nothing here, nothing official. It was almost like the show came from nowhere." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. "But you remember it, don't you? Not just your daughter's reactions. You remember seeing it, don't you?" The librarian hesitated, her hands fidgeting as she glanced around again, clearly unsettled. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I remember it too. But my memories are strange, as if I were watching something that was meant only for children. I remember seeing the puppets, but the scenes were strange, distorted. Sometimes the images would blur, or the screen would go dark, and I'd see faces in the static, faces that weren't human. Mrs. Jenkins paused, a flicker of fear in her eyes. It was as if Candle Cove was watching us, not the other way around. Emma's curiosity burned even brighter. She'd heard stories of haunted media, cursed records, and even mind-altering broadcasts. But this was something different, something insidious. Whatever Candle Cove was, it seemed to be woven into the very fabric of this town's memories. After hours of fruitless searching in the library, Emma decided to take a walk through Ironton, hoping to find locals who might remember Candle Cove and could offer their own accounts. She stopped by an antique shop and a few small cafes, striking up casual conversations with anyone willing to talk. Most people seemed hesitant, their eyes shifting away when she mentioned the show, as if they were reluctant to remember. Finally, she met Helen Thorne, a woman in her 50s with pale, thin features and an anxious expression. Helen was seated outside the general store, sipping tea as she gazed at the distant hills. Emma introduced herself and brought up Candle Cove, bracing herself for another vague recollection or dismissive response. But Helen's face tightened, her gaze growing distant, haunted. "My brother," Helen began, her voice barely a whisper. "He used to watch Candle Cove religiously. I was older, didn't pay much attention to it, but I remember the way he'd sit there, like he was in a trance. He'd barely blink, his face all slack, like he was somewhere else. And then, one day, he started talking to someone named Janice. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had read about Janice from the online accounts. She was supposedly a character on the show, a young girl who went on adventures with the puppet pirate Percy. Helen's expression grew strained, her hands trembling as she continued. My brother said Janice was real, that she was his friend, and that she wanted him to join her on the ship. I thought it was just imagination, but then he started to change. He wouldn't sleep, would talk to people who weren't there. He'd say things like, Janice says she's waiting for me, or I'm going to go where they are. I thought it was some phase, but Helen trailed off, her face paling as she looked away, her gaze clouded with an old pain. One morning, he was gone. Just gone. We searched the whole town, the fields, the nearby woods. They never found a trace of him. Emma's mind reeled as she listened, her stomach churning. The missing children, the ones that had been mentioned on the forum, were real. The rumors of children disappearing after watching Candle Cove weren't just internet folklore. They were part of Ironton's dark history. After leaving Helen, Emma made her way to the town's police station, hoping to access records of these disappearances. She met Officer Carlson, a grizzled man in his 60s who seemed more interested in his coffee than talking to a journalist. But when Emma mentioned Candle Cove, his demeanor changed. He set his cup down, his gaze narrowing as he studied her. You've been talking to people around town, haven't you? He asked, his voice low, his tone wary. Emma nodded. I'm trying to learn more about this show, Candle Cove. People seem afraid to remember it, but the memories are there. I've heard stories of children who went missing, children who spoke of characters from the show as if they were real. Officer Carlson's expression darkened. I remember it all right. I was a young officer back then, fresh out of the academy. The kids that disappeared, they were all around the same age, about 8 or 9. They all talked about that show, about going to the ship, or meeting Pirate Percy. Their parents said the kids would talk in their sleep, say things that didn't make sense, as if they were repeating something they'd heard. Emma felt a chill settle over her as he spoke, each detail filling her with a growing sense of dread. What happened to them? She asked quietly, almost fearing the answer. Officer Carlson took a deep breath, his gaze turning inward. We searched for weeks, combed the entire area, every inch of forest and field, but it was like they vanished into thin air. No bodies, no clues, nothing, just gone. And the strangest part? A few weeks after they disappeared, parents started finding notes in the kids' handwriting, strange little messages tucked into their closets, under their beds. What kind of messages? Emma asked, her heart pounding. Officer Carlson's voice lowered, his face clouded with unease. Messages saying things like, I'm with Percy, or Janice is taking me to the ship, as if they were still there, somewhere. A silence fell between them, heavy and thick with unspoken fears. Emma felt the weight of the mystery pressing down on her, the sense that she was brushing up against something far darker than she'd anticipated. That evening, Emma returned to her motel, her mind racing. She sat at the small desk in her room, her notes spread out in front of her. Every detail, every story she'd heard only added to the mystery, but none of it made sense. It was as if Candle Cove was more than a television show, as if it were some kind of gateway, a conduit for something ancient and malicious, something that preyed on the minds of children. As she sat in the dim light, she felt a strange compulsion to turn on the television, to scroll through the channels in search of something she couldn't name. She picked up the remote, her fingers trembling as she pressed the buttons, the screen flickering with static and faint images. The channels seemed to blur together, the images twisting, distorting, as though they were bleeding into each other. And then, for a brief moment, she saw it, a flash of something that made her blood run cold. On the screen was a face, pale and hollow-eyed, a grotesque grin stretching across its mouth. The image was grainy, distorted, but she recognized it instantly. It was Pirate Percy. The screen flickered, and the image was gone, replaced by static. Emma's hands shook as she set the remote down, her heart racing. She stared at the screen, half expecting the face to reappear, but there was only the faint hum of static. She backed away from the television, her mind reeling. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of something vast and dark, a mystery that stretched beyond her understanding. Candle Cove was more than a show, more than a memory. It was a doorway, a crack in reality through which something dark and ancient had slipped. That night, Emma dreamed of the ocean, of dark, rolling waves that seemed to stretch into eternity. She stood alone on a foggy shore, the air thick with the scent of salt and decay. In the distance, she saw a ship, a dark, looming shape that seemed to float above the water, shrouded in mist. The ship drifted closer, its sails tattered, its wood rotting and splintered. And then she saw them, the figures on the deck, shadowy shapes with hollow eyes and empty smiles. They watched her, their faces twisted in grotesque grins, their eyes filled with a dark, unfeeling hunger. Among them stood Pirate Percy, his mouth stretched into an unnatural smile, his hollow eyes fixed on her with a look that sent a shiver through her soul. "Come with us," he whispered, his voice drifting across the water, soft and cold. "Come to the ship." Emma woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat. She sat up, clutching the sheets, her mind racing as the echoes of the dream faded. But even as she tried to shake it off, she felt the lingering presence of the ship, the figures, the voice that had called to her. They were real, she realized, the truth settling over her like a shroud. Candle Cove wasn't just a show, wasn't just a memory. It was a force, a dark, insidious presence that had reached out from beyond the veil, that had preyed on the minds of the innocent, drawing them into its world. Emma knew that she couldn't stop now. She had to see this through, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. She had to confront Candle Cove, to face whatever lay hidden in the shadows of Ironton, even if it meant stepping into the darkness herself. Chapter 3. The Missing Children. Emma couldn't shake the lingering dread that seemed to shadow her every step. The deeper she delved into the mystery of Candle Cove, the more she felt it pulling her into a world where reality and nightmare intertwined. She sensed that she was no longer just investigating a forgotten show. She was unraveling a tapestry of memories woven with fear, grief, and darkness. The tales of Candle Cove and the disappearances it left in its wake were no longer just stories. They were lives, fragments of souls lost to the shadows. On her third day in Ironton, Emma decided to follow up on the missing children she'd heard about from Helen and Officer Carlson. She visited the town hall, where she hoped to find official records. The records room was dimly lit, a narrow space filled with rows of filing cabinets that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, each breath heavy as she thumbed through the files. Finally, she came across a thin file marked 1971, Missing Persons. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her heart pounding. There were 3 missing children listed in the file, each one with a grainy black and white photograph clipped to the pages. Their names were Lucas Trent, Sarah Miller, and James Marsh. Each child was around 8 or 9 years old, and each case file was filled with pages of fruitless police reports, witness statements, and search logs. The files were hauntingly thin, the children's faces frozen in time, their expressions filled with innocence and hope. But the strange thing, the thing that sent a chill down Emma's spine, was that each child's file contained a brief, handwritten note by the detective assigned to the case, mentioning the same eerie detail. Each child was last seen sitting in front of their television, watching static. Emma read and reread the reports, her mind racing. There were no last-minute sightings, no farewell notes. The children had simply vanished, their last moments spent staring into static, as if they'd slipped into a world beyond the screen, a place that only they could see. Emma spent the rest of the afternoon talking to the few people who had known the missing children. She met Lucas Trent's mother, Margaret, who lived on the outskirts of town in a small, faded house surrounded by overgrown grass. Margaret was an older woman, her face etched with lines of sorrow that seemed too deep to heal. She invited Emma in, her eyes heavy with an unspoken grief. Margaret led Emma into a small living room, its walls lined with faded photographs of Lucas. She took a seat on the edge of a worn couch, wringing her hands as she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "He loved that show," she said, her gaze distant. "Candle Cove. It was his favorite. Every day after school he'd rush home, plop down in front of the TV and turn it on. And he'd sit there for hours, just staring. I thought it was strange, but he was a quiet child. Always had his head in the clouds." Emma leaned forward, her heart heavy as she listened. "Did he ever say anything about the show? About what he saw?" Margaret's face paled, her gaze dropping to her hands. He'd talk to himself sometimes. Whisper things that didn't make sense. He'd say that Pirate Percy was real, that Janice was his friend and that she was going to take him to the ship. She shuddered, her voice cracking. "One night, I heard him talking in his sleep. I went to check on him and he was laughing, whispering something about the skin taker. He said the skin taker was going to make him part of the crew." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. The skin taker. She'd read about it in the online forum posts. A nightmarish puppet with a jaw that never moved quite right, always on the verge of breaking. She could only imagine how terrifying it must have been for Margaret, listening to her son describe something so horrific, something that no child should ever know. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "The night he disappeared, I found him sitting in front of the TV, staring at static. His face was blank, like he was in a trance. I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't respond. And then, in the morning, he was gone. Just gone." Emma reached out, placing a hand on Margaret's. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I can't imagine what you've gone through." Margaret looked at her, her eyes filled with a hollow, aching sorrow. "Sometimes I think I hear him," she whispered. "At night, in the quiet, I hear his voice, calling from somewhere far away. I know it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but it feels so real." Emma's heart ached as she listened, the weight of Margaret's grief pressing down on her. She thanked the woman for her time, leaving with a heavy heart, her mind racing with questions, each one darker than the last. Her next stop was the Miller household, where Sarah Miller's younger sister, Abby, now lived. Abby was in her late 40s, with short greying hair and a weary expression that spoke of years spent carrying the weight of her sister's disappearance. Abby welcomed Emma in, leading her to a small, cluttered kitchen. They sat at the table, a pot of tea steaming between them. Abby poured them both a cup, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "I was just a kid when Sarah disappeared," Abby said, her voice soft. "But I remember her, watching that show, Candle Cove. She was obsessed with it, always sitting in front of the TV, staring at the screen like she was hypnotized." Emma nodded, listening intently as Abby continued. "She'd talk about it all the time. She'd tell me about Pirate Percy and Janice, about the ship and the adventures they'd go on. But then she started saying strange things that scared me." Abby's voice dropped to a whisper. "She said that Janice wanted her to join the crew, that the ship was coming to take her away. She even told me that if I listened closely, I could hear the ocean through the TV." Emma's heart skipped a beat as she listened, a chill settling over her. "I didn't believe her," Abby continued. "But one night, I decided to try it. I crept into the living room after everyone was asleep and turned on the TV. I listened, and for a moment, I thought I heard it. The sound of waves, faint and distant, like the ocean was on the other side of the screen." She shuddered, her face pale. "It scared me so much I ran back to my room and hid under the covers. I never went near that TV again." Emma's mind raced as she took in Abby's story. The ocean, the ship, the invitation to join the crew. It was all connected, woven into the fabric of Candle Cove, a dark and twisted tale that had somehow bled into reality. That night, Emma returned to her motel, her thoughts weighed down by the stories she'd heard. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her laptop as she scrolled through her notes, each one more disturbing than the last. She felt as though she were piecing together a puzzle. Each story, each memory, a fragment of a larger, darker picture. But even as she tried to make sense of it all, a strange feeling crept over her. A feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around the room, her heart pounding. But there was no one there, only the faint hum of the television in the corner, its screen dark and silent. With a deep breath, Emma decided to turn on the TV. She knew it was irrational, that the stories were just that, stories. But a part of her needed to see for herself, to confront the fear that had taken root in her mind. She picked up the remote, her hands trembling as she pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, filling the room with static, the soft crackling sound filling her ears. She stared at it, her pulse quickening as she felt a strange pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw her closer to the screen. And then, just for a moment, she saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow shifting within the static. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, a figure standing just beyond the veil of white noise watching her. Her heart raced as she leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the screen. The figure grew clearer, its shape taking form, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and a wide, unsettling grin. His face was pale, his features sharp and angular, and his mouth stretched into a smile that was too wide, too fixed, as if it had been painted on. "Pirate Percy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure seemed to hear her, its grin widening as it leaned closer, its eyes dark and empty, filled with a cold, unfeeling malice. For a brief moment, Emma felt as though the figure was reaching out to her, its hand extending toward the screen, as though it were trying to pull her into its world. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only static. Emma stumbled back, her heart racing, her mind reeling. She turned off the TV, her hands shaking as she struggled to catch her breath. She felt as though she had brushed up against something ancient, something malevolent, a darkness that lurked just beyond the edges of reality. As she sat there trembling, she realized that Candle Cove wasn't just a show. It was a doorway, a conduit for something far darker than she'd imagined. And she knew deep down that it was still watching, waiting, its hollow eyes fixed on her, pulling her deeper into its world. On the following day, Emma woke with a sense of dread that hung over her like a shadow. She couldn't shake the memory of Pirate Percy's grin, the cold, hollow eyes that seemed to follow her even after she'd turned off the TV. She felt as though a part of her had been marked, claimed by the darkness that lurked within Candle Cove. But she knew she couldn't stop now. She was too far in, too entangled in the mystery to turn back. There was something about Candle Cove that went beyond explanation, beyond reason. It was as if the show had a life of its own, a will that reached out to those who dared to seek it. Emma steeled herself, her mind set on finding the truth. She knew that whatever lay at the heart of Candle Cove was dark, twisted, a force that had left scars on those it touched. But she was determined to confront it, to face the shadows, no matter the cost. And as she walked through the quiet streets of Ironton, she felt the weight of unseen eyes on her, watching, waiting, as if the darkness itself had taken notice of her, as if it knew she was coming. And deep within the static, Pirate Percy grinned. Chapter 4. The Obsessive Creator. Emma lay awake, her mind restless as she replayed her findings about Candle Cove again and again. David Colt, the eccentric creator of The Twisted Show, had seemingly vanished without a trace, leaving behind a show that whispered of nightmares and drew children into a darkness from which many hadn't returned. Emma knew she was uncovering something dark, something that had scarred this town deeply, and each piece of information seemed to pull her further into the shadows surrounding Candle Cove. The next morning, Emma set out to learn more about Colt, determined to understand who he was and what had driven him to create such a twisted show. She returned to the library, hoping that Mrs. Jenkins might know more about the man whose sinister legacy still haunted Ironton. Mrs. Jenkins looked uneasy as Emma approached the subject, her eyes flickering with a glimmer of recognition and old fear. "You're really set on learning about David Colt, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. Emma nodded, feeling a sense of urgency she couldn't quite explain. "Yes, I need to understand him. It feels like he's left traces everywhere, threads connecting the children's disappearances, the strange broadcasts, and this other realm he seemed to believe in. Mrs. Jenkins sighed, glancing around as if to make sure they were alone. Colt was unusual, to put it lightly. When he first came to town, he was charming, charismatic even, claimed he was here to revolutionize children's television. At first, people liked him. He spoke about the magic of childhood and imagination, about creating a world where children could see themselves reflected back through stories. But it didn't take long for that charm to wear thin. Emma leaned in, her curiosity piqued. What changed? Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, her eyes darkening. He started talking about children's minds as gateways, about their innocence as a kind of power that could be harnessed. He claimed that children were closer to other worlds, realms beyond our understanding. A chill ran down Emma's spine. Colt's ideas sounded like the ramblings of someone unhinged, someone who viewed children not as individuals, but as tools for his own dark vision. Did he ever elaborate on what he meant by those realms? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Jenkins nodded slowly. Colt was obsessed with the idea of liminality. He'd say that children existed in a liminal space, somewhere between reality and imagination. He believed that if he could create the right environment, he could use that space to open doors. And Candle Cove was meant to be that environment. Emma felt a surge of dread as she listened, each word adding to the darkness surrounding Colt and his creation. What do you mean by open doors? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Jenkins looked away, her face pale. Colt believed that he could tap into children's minds, use their imaginations to create a bridge between this world and something else. He never said exactly what that was, but he hinted at it, spoke of it in vague, ominous terms. He claimed it was a place where he could unlock true vision, where he could show them the real world. But all it did was scare people. Emma took a shaky breath, her mind reeling. Colt's ambitions were far darker than she had imagined. He hadn't just created Candle Cove as a show for children. He had crafted it as a portal, a conduit for something beyond comprehension. Though determined to understand the full scope of Colt's work, Emma decided to investigate his old home, which she learned from Mrs. Jenkins had been abandoned for decades. It was located on the outskirts of town, a decrepit, weather-beaten house that looked as though it had been swallowed by the forest surrounding it. The locals avoided the area, claiming it was cursed, that strange sounds and lights could be seen around the property at night. As Emma approached the house, she felt a strange pressure in the air, as though the house itself were watching her, waiting for her to step inside. The structure loomed before her, its windows dark and hollow, its walls covered in ivy and rot. She took a deep breath, steeling herself before pushing the creaky front door open. Inside, the house was dim and musty, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. Dust covered every surface, and the floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way through the entryway. The walls were lined with strange symbols, crudely carved into the wood, spirals and shapes that seemed to twist and shift in the dim light. She recognized some of them from the notebook Officer Carlson had shown her. The same symbols Colt had drawn in his notes, symbols of liminality and transition. Emma moved cautiously, feeling a chill settle over her as she explored the house. She entered a small sitting room, where faded photographs covered the walls, images of children with blank expressions, their faces frozen in eerie stillness. Among them, she spotted a photograph of Colt himself, standing beside a small puppet theatre. His face was gaunt, his eyes dark and intense, as though he were looking beyond the camera, beyond the photographer, into something only he could see. Her gaze fell on a dusty old television set in the corner of the room. The screen was cracked, and the knobs were missing, but it radiated an unsettling energy, as though it were still somehow connected to the forgotten channel Colt had used to broadcast Candle Cove. She resisted the urge to touch it, feeling a strange pull, as though the television were calling to her, beckoning her to turn it on. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound, a soft, childlike whisper that seemed to echo through the empty house. She froze, her heart pounding as she listened, her ears straining to catch the words. "Come play with us. Come to the ship." Emma's blood ran cold as the whisper faded into silence, the words lingering in the air like a ghostly echo. She turned, her eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. Only the empty, silent house, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch and twist around her. In the next room, Emma found what she assumed had been Colt's study. The walls were covered in papers, notes scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand. Pages from children's storybooks were tacked to the walls, each one altered with strange symbols and notes written in the margins. Colt had scribbled phrases like, "Open the door, and they are waiting," across the pages, his handwriting growing more erratic, more desperate, as if he were descending into madness. Emma spotted a large leather-bound journal lying on the desk, its cover worn and cracked with age. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her hands, and opened it to the first page. The words were scrawled in Colt's familiar handwriting, the ink smudged and faded with time. "The children are the key," the first line read. "Through their eyes I can see beyond. They are my bridge, my passage to the other side." Emma shuddered as she read, each word filling her with a growing sense of horror. "I have crafted the puppets with purpose. Percy is the seeker, the one who will guide them to the ship. The skin taker is the guardian, a creature of fear, a being that exists only to consume innocence. Each character serves a role, each one a piece of the puzzle, a key to the liminal space." She turned the pages, each one filled with Colt's feverish notes, his descriptions of rituals and rites, his plans to use Candle Cove as a vessel for something dark and ancient. "The show is only the beginning," he had written on one page. "Once the children have crossed over, I will be able to follow. I will find the doorway, I will join them on the other side, and together we will see the world as it truly is." Emma's hands shook as she closed the journal, the weight of Colt's words pressing down on her like a physical presence. He hadn't just created Candle Cove to scare children. He had crafted it as a means of crossing into another realm, a place beyond life and death, where he could wield ultimate control. Suddenly, she heard the faint sound of static drifting through the house, a soft, crackling noise that seemed to come from the television in the other room. She felt a chill settle over her as she turned, her heart pounding as she made her way back to the sitting room. The television screen was flickering, the static growing louder as she approached. She could see faint shapes forming within the static, shadows that seemed to move and twist, their forms shifting like smoke. She watched in horror as the image took shape. A dark, fog-shrouded ship drifting on a black sea, its deck filled with shadowy figures with hollow eyes and empty smiles. And then she saw him, Pirate Percy, standing at the helm, his grin wide and fixed, his eyes dark and hollow. He stared directly at her, his gaze piercing through the screen, as though he could see her, as though he were reaching out from the other side. "Come play with us, Emma," he whispered, his voice soft and cold. "Come to the ship." Emma stumbled back, her heart racing, her mind reeling as Percy's voice filled the room. She felt a strange pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw her closer to the screen, as though something beyond the glass were calling to her, beckoning her to step into the darkness. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice trembling. "You're not real. This isn't real." But the image remained, Percy's grin widening as he extended a hand toward her, his hollow eyes fixed on her with a look that sent a shiver through her soul. She felt as though she were being pulled into the screen, drawn into the static, into the darkness that lay beyond. With a surge of fear, she forced herself to turn away, stumbling out of the room and back into the dim hallway. She felt as though the walls were closing in around her, the shadows twisting and shifting, filling the space with a sense of dread so intense it left her breathless. As she made her way out of the house, she heard the whisper again, a soft, childlike voice that echoed through the empty rooms. "Come play with us. Come to the ship." Emma burst through the front door, gasping for breath as she stepped into the daylight. She felt as though she had escaped a nightmare, a place where reality and darkness had intertwined, leaving her feeling hollow and shaken. She knew now that Candle Cove was more than just a show. It was a doorway, a conduit to something ancient and malevolent. Colt had used it to lure children into his twisted world, to pull them into a space where he could control them, where he could use their innocence to fuel his dark vision. And as she stood there, staring at the decaying house, she felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her, the faint sound of static drifting through the air, a reminder that Candle Cove was still with her, that it was waiting, watching, its dark, twisted world lurking just beyond the veil. Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself. She knew she couldn't turn back now. The forgotten channel had found her, and it would not let her go. With a final glance at the house, she turned and walked away, the weight of Colt's legacy heavy on her shoulders, the dark knowledge of Candle Cove echoing in her mind. And in the shadows, Pirate Percy grinned. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Channel. Emma awoke the next morning with a lingering sense of dread. The notebook pages haunted her, the grotesque sketches and twisted words looping in her mind, each line pulling her deeper into the darkness that surrounded Candle Cove. She had never come across anything like this in her work, a creation so dark that it seemed to bridge the gap between horror and reality, between imagination and a world beyond. Over breakfast, she reviewed her notes and was struck by something Officer Carlson had mentioned. Colt had broadcast Candle Cove through an unusual, forgotten channel. It wasn't an official network, but something off the main frequencies, a channel that didn't appear on any public listings. Emma felt a thrill of dread and curiosity wash over her. It was as if Candle Cove had found its way into the minds of children who weren't supposed to see it, slipping into their living rooms as a phantom transmission that evaded adult eyes. She decided to speak with a few people around town who might remember this forgotten channel. As she made her way to the local cafe, she noticed a figure watching her from across the street, a tall, thin man with dark, hollow eyes. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, and he seemed to linger just outside her line of sight. But when she looked directly at him, he vanished, as if he'd never been there. Emma shivered, dismissing it as the stress and lack of sleep catching up to her. At the cafe, she found herself seated next to Tommy Wells, a retired electrician in his 70s, who, according to locals, had serviced the television antennas around Ironton during the 1970s. Emma introduced herself, explaining that she was researching the town's history with local television, and he gave her a curious look. "You're not here asking about Candle Cove, are you?" he asked, his voice low, eyes wary. Emma nodded, feeling a thrill of dread. "Yes, I've heard that the show aired on an unusual channel, something off the main networks. Do you remember anything about it?" Tommy took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he stirred his coffee. "I remember the talk. Back then, we didn't have all the fancy networks you folks have now. We only got a handful of channels, and we relied on these big, clunky antennas to pick them up. Every now and then, I'd get a call from a parent asking if there was something wrong with their signal, saying their kid was watching a channel that didn't seem to exist." Emma's pulse quickened. "A channel that didn't exist?" He nodded. "Yeah. It was strange. I'd go to their houses, check the wiring, the antennas, and everything would be fine. But the parents said their kids were watching something that wasn't coming in through the normal frequencies. They called it the Forgotten Channel, because it wasn't on any list, wasn't part of any official broadcast." Emma leaned closer, her heart racing. "Did you ever see what was on it?" Tommy shook his head, his face pale. "No, I tried tuning in once just to see what the fuss was about. All I got was static. But the kids, they said they could see a show, a puppet show, with a pirate and a little girl. They called it Candle Cove." Emma felt a chill settle over her as she listened, each word adding to the mystery, each detail filling her with a sense of dread. The Forgotten Channel wasn't just a mystery, it was a gateway, something Colt had used to broadcast his twisted creation directly into the minds of children, bypassing the usual restrictions of reality. "Why do you think only the kids could see it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tommy's gaze drifted to the window, his face clouded with a haunted look. "I don't know. But whatever Colt was doing, he was using something unnatural. I don't think that show was meant for human eyes. Or maybe it was only meant for the minds of those who still believed in magic, in the shadows. Kids, with their innocence, their open minds. They were the only ones who could see it." Emma left the cafe with a sinking feeling in her chest. the sense that Candle Cove was more than a cursed show. It was a conduit, a bridge between worlds that Colt had somehow accessed and manipulated. The Forgotten Channel was his method, his way of slipping past reality and into a space where he could work his dark magic. Later that evening, Emma sat in her motel room, staring at the television, her heart pounding as she held the remote. She felt drawn to the static, compelled to see if the Forgotten Channel would appear for her, if she could tap into the strange frequency that Colt had used. Part of her was terrified of what she might see, but her curiosity, her need to understand the darkness that had claimed Ironton's children, outweighed her fear. Taking a deep breath, Emma began to scan through the channels, moving past the regular networks, searching for any hint of static, any flicker of something unusual. The screen flickered, a soft hum filling the room as she moved further from the main frequencies, the images growing more distorted, more fragmented. And then she saw it, a flash of movement, a flicker of color within the static. She froze, her heart pounding as the image took form, as the screen filled with the faint outline of a ship floating on a dark sea. The image was grainy, distorted, but she recognized it instantly. It was the pirate ship. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she watched, her eyes fixed on the screen. The ship drifted across the water, shrouded in mist, its sails tattered, its wood rotting. Shadows moved on the deck, vague shapes that seemed to blend with the darkness, their hollow eyes watching her, their faces twisted into eerie, grotesque grins. And then the camera panned, revealing Pirate Percy standing at the helm, his grin wide and fixed, his eyes dark and empty. He stared directly at her, his hollow gaze piercing through the screen, as if he could see her, as if he were reaching out from the other side. "Come play with us, Emma," he whispered, his voice soft and chilling. "Come to the ship." Emma's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen with fear as Percy's voice filled the room, as though he were standing right beside her. She felt a strange pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw her closer to the screen, as though something beyond the glass were reaching out, beckoning her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice trembling. "You're not real. This isn't real." But the image remained, Percy's grin widening as he extended a hand toward her, his hollow eyes fixed on her with a look that sent a shiver through her soul. She felt as though she were being pulled into the screen, drawn into the static, into the darkness that lay beyond. Just as she felt herself slipping, she forced herself to look away, pressing the power button on the remote with trembling hands. The screen went dark, the room falling into an eerie silence, the only sound her own ragged breathing. Emma sat there, her body shaking, her mind reeling. She had seen Candle Cove, had touched the edge of the Forgotten Channel, and it had touched her back. Percy's voice echoed in her mind, his invitation lingering in the air like a dark promise. The next morning, Emma decided to visit the edge of town, where she'd heard rumors of an old abandoned broadcast tower. She hoped that by examining it, she might find some clue as to how Colt had transmitted Candle Cove, how he had managed to create a frequency that only children could see. The tower loomed over the landscape, rusted and forgotten, a relic of a time when television was still a novelty in small towns like Ironton. The surrounding area was overgrown with weeds and brambles, the air thick with the scent of decay. As she approached the tower, she noticed strange symbols carved into the base, spirals, triangles, and twisted faces, symbols she recognized from Colt's notebook. Emma felt a sense of dread settle over her as she examined the symbols, each one filled with a dark, malignant energy. Colt had used this place, had transformed it into a conduit for his twisted creation, a way to channel his dark vision directly into the minds of children. And then she saw something that made her blood run cold. Scattered around the base of the tower were small, child-sized shoes, weathered and faded, as though they had been left there as offerings. Emma's heart ached as she realized what they represented. The children who had watched Candle Cove, who had vanished without a trace. It was as if their presence lingered here, trapped in the space between worlds, unable to move on. Emma knelt down, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the shoes, her heart heavy with sorrow. She felt a strange energy radiating from it, a sense of longing, of innocence lost. The shoe was cold, the material stiff with age, but it felt alive, as though it still held a piece of the child who had once worn it. A faint whisper drifted through the air, a voice soft and childlike, filled with a haunting sadness. "Help us." Emma's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced around, but there was no one there, only the empty, desolate landscape and the abandoned tower looming over her. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The whisper came again, soft and faint, as though carried on the wind. "We're lost. We're waiting." Emma felt tears prick her eyes, the weight of the children's voices pressing down on her, filling her with a sense of helplessness. She knew now, beyond any doubt, that Colt's creation had left scars, that the Forgotten Channel had taken more than just the children's innocence. It had taken their souls, trapping them in a place where they could never find peace. As she stood there, holding the shoe, she made a silent promise to uncover the truth, to break the hold that Candle Cove had over these lost children, to free them from the darkness that Colt had created. But as she turned to leave, she felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her, the faint sound of static filling the air, a reminder that Candle Cove was still with her, that it was waiting, watching, its dark, twisted world lurking just beyond the veil. And she knew, deep down, that she couldn't turn back now. The Forgotten Channel had found her, and it would not let her go. Chapter 6. The Pirate's Song. Emma returned to her motel room that evening with a sense of dread so intense it left her physically drained. Her investigation into Candle Cove had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated. David Colt had created the show as more than a children's program. It was a gateway, a dark ritual designed to lure children into a space between worlds, a place of shadows and half-truths where twisted beings like Pirate Percy and the Skin Taker lingered. That night, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The motel room was quiet, yet every shadow seemed to shift, every sound seemed amplified, as though something were lurking just beyond the walls, waiting for her to let her guard down. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of something pressing down on her, a weight that felt ancient, malicious. Finally, around midnight, she drifted into a fitful sleep, her mind pulled into a strange, unsettling dream. Emma found herself standing on a dark shore, the ground beneath her feet cold and wet. A thick fog rolled across the landscape, obscuring her vision and filling the air with a damp chill. She could hear the faint sound of waves crashing against rocks, and the scent of salt hung heavy in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a faint melody drifted through the fog, haunting and melodic, yet filled with a darkness that made her skin crawl. She recognized the tune immediately. It was the song from Candle Cove, the eerie, childlike melody that had accompanied Pirate Percy's introduction in the show. The song had always been simple, just a few notes repeated, yet it held a strange, hypnotic power, as though it were a lullaby for something ancient and forgotten. As Emma listened, she felt a strange pull, a compulsion to follow the music, to walk further into the fog. She took a hesitant step forward, her feet sinking into the wet sand, her heart pounding as she moved toward the source of the melody. The fog thickened around her, pressing in from all sides until she could barely see a foot in front of her. And then, through the haze, she saw it. The outline of a ship, its dark form looming over the shore, its sails tattered and torn. The ship seemed to hover just above the water, its hull blackened and decayed, as though it had been adrift for centuries. Shadows moved on the deck, their forms barely visible through the fog, yet their presence filled her with a sense of dread so intense it left her breathless. A voice drifted through the air, soft and childlike, yet filled with a twisted glee. "Come to the ship, Emma," the voice whispered. "Join us on the other side." Emma froze, her heart racing as she recognized the voice. It was Pirate Percy. She took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears as she stared at the ship, at the dark figures watching her from the deck. She could feel their eyes on her, cold and hollow, filled with a hunger that seemed to reach out from the shadows, wrapping around her, pulling her closer. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice trembling. "This isn't real. This is just a dream. But the ship remained, its dark form solid and unyielding, a silent witness to the horrors that lay within. Pirate Percy's voice drifted through the air again, soft and mocking, as though he could sense her fear. "Come play with us, Emma," he whispered. "Come to the other side." As he spoke, the shadows on the deck began to move, their forms shifting and twisting as they made their way to the edge of the ship, their hollow eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She could see their faces now, pale and twisted, their mouths stretched into wide, unnatural grins, their eyes empty and soulless. And then, in one horrifying moment, she recognized them. They were the faces of the children who had gone missing from Ironton. Lucas Trent, Sarah Miller, James Marsh. All of them were there, their faces distorted, their eyes hollow, their expressions twisted into grotesque parodies of joy. They reached out to her, their hands grasping at the air, their mouths moving in silent screams that echoed through the fog. Emma stumbled back, her heart racing, her mind reeling as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The children were trapped, their souls bound to the ship, their innocence twisted and consumed by the darkness that surrounded Candle Cove. They were prisoners, captives of the show, their minds forever lost to the world on the other side. "No!" she cried, her voice filled with desperation. "You can't have them. You can't keep them here." Pirate Percy's grin widened, his hollow eyes glinting with a dark, twisted amusement. "They belong to us now, Emma," he whispered. "Just as you will. Come to the ship. Come to the other side. It's the only way." Emma felt a surge of terror as Percy's words sank in, the weight of his invitation pressing down on her like a physical force. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, the fog thickening, the shadows stretching toward her, as though they were alive, as though they were reaching out to pull her into their world. With a final burst of willpower, Emma tore herself away, stumbling backward, her heart pounding as she fought against the pull of the ship, the call of the darkness that lay beyond the fog. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the wet sand, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as she fled from the ship, from the shadows, from the twisted, hollow faces of the children who watched her with empty eyes. As she ran, the melody of the pirate's song faded into the distance, the haunting notes drifting through the fog, lingering in the air like a ghostly echo. And then, with a gasp, Emma jolted awake, her body drenched in sweat, her heart racing as she stared at the ceiling, her mind reeling from the nightmare. The following day, Emma felt a heavy exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. It was as if the dream had drained something vital from her, leaving her feeling hollow and raw. She couldn't shake the memory of the children's faces, their hollow eyes, their twisted smiles. They were trapped, lost to a darkness that had taken them beyond the reach of the living. Determined to make sense of what she had seen, Emma decided to visit the local library again. She combed through the archives, searching for any record of David Colt's life before he came to Ironton, hoping to find some clue as to what had driven him to create Candle Cove. She found little in the way of official records, but she stumbled upon a dusty, obscure journal tucked away on a high shelf. It was filled with local folklore and ghost stories, tales of hauntings and curses that had plagued Ironton for generations. One story caught her eye. It was about a man who had come to town in the early 1900s, a self-proclaimed spiritualist who claimed he could commune with the dead. According to the journal, the man had attempted a ritual to open a gateway to the other side, using children as conduits to channel the energy he needed. The ritual had failed, but several children went missing around the same time, their bodies never found, their souls rumored to have been lost in the space between worlds. Emma's mind raced as she read. David Colt had come to Ironton decades later, but the parallels between his work and the old legend were uncanny. It was as if he had been inspired by the same dark knowledge, the same belief that children held the key to unlocking forbidden realms. She made her way to the town archives, hoping to find anything that would confirm the connection between Colt and the old spiritualist. She pored over documents, old newspaper clippings, and town records, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. And then she found it. A journal entry written by Colt himself, hidden within a file of miscellaneous records, its edges yellowed with age. "The children are the key," Colt had written, his handwriting scrawled and uneven. "Through their innocence, I can reach the other side. They are my bridge, my passage into the world beyond. Pirate Percy will guide them, the Skin Taker will guard them, and Janice will lead them to the ship. Together they will see the truth." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine as she read, the weight of Colt's words pressing down on her like a dark cloud. He had known exactly what he was doing. He had crafted Candle Cove as a ritual, a dark ceremony designed to lure children into a world where he could control them, where he could use their innocence to fuel his own twisted vision. Or Xamsa. As she left the archives, Emma felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around, but there was no one there, only the empty, silent hallways of the old building. Yet she could feel the weight of unseen eyes on her, a presence that seemed to follow her every step. That night, as she lay in bed, the melody of the pirate's song drifted through her mind, haunting and relentless. She could hear the soft, childlike voices of the lost children, their whispers filled with a longing that tugged at her heart. "Come to the ship, Emma," they whispered. "Come to the other side." Emma clenched her fists, fighting the pull, refusing to give in to the darkness that seemed to surround her. She knew now that Candle Cove was more than just a show. It was a doorway, a bridge to a world where the souls of the innocent were bound, trapped in a twisted, eternal nightmare. But she also knew that she couldn't turn back. The children were calling to her, reaching out from beyond the veil, their voices filled with a desperation that pierced her heart. They were lost, but she was their only hope, the only one who could free them from the darkness that held them captive. With a final, determined breath, Emma made a silent vow. She would find a way to break the hold that Candle Cove had over Ironton, to sever the connection that bound the children to the other side. She would confront the darkness, face the twisted beings that lurked within the show, and bring the children back. As she drifted into sleep, the pirate's song echoed in her mind, haunting and relentless, a dark reminder of the journey that lay ahead. And in the darkness, Pirate Percy waited, his hollow eyes watching, his grin wide and unyielding, a promise of the horrors that awaited her on the other side. Chapter 7. The Lost Episode. Emma knew that she had no choice but to push deeper into the darkness of Candle Cove. Every lead, every twisted dream and whisper seemed to beckon her further, as though the shadows themselves wanted her to find something. Some answer hidden beneath layers of nightmares. She couldn't ignore the pleas of the children she had seen in her dreams, their hollow, haunted eyes, the terror on their faces as they lingered aboard that cursed ship. After her last nightmare, she was more certain than ever that there was another world at work, one that Candle Cove had breached, a dark and twisted place where the children had become prisoners of something ancient and malevolent. And she was the only one who could pull them back. The next morning, Emma woke with an unsettling feeling that she couldn't shake, a sensation that lingered at the back of her mind as if she were still in that other world, a world where shadows had depth, where nightmares seemed more real than waking life. She went to the library in search of anything she had missed, a detail that might provide a clue to stopping Candle Cove's sinister hold over Ironton. As she entered, Mrs. Jenkins greeted her with a somber expression. She'd clearly heard about Emma's disturbing dream from the other night, and had become both fascinated and fearful of what Emma was uncovering. "I found something in the basement," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice low and cautious as she handed Emma a dusty old videotape. It was stored with some of the archived town footage, old news reports and such. "But this tape, it's different." Emma took the tape carefully, her hands shaking slightly. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, her eyes flickering with an old buried fear. "The label said Candle Cove Episode X. I'd never seen it before, but I'd heard stories about it. They say this is the episode that never aired, the one that David Colt recorded just before he vanished." Emma felt a chill run through her. A lost episode, a piece of the puzzle that no one had seen. "Did you watch it?" The librarian shook her head. "No, I wouldn't dare, but something told me you needed to see it, that it's meant for you." Emma nodded, swallowing her fear as she took the tape. She thanked Mrs. Jenkins and left, her heart pounding as she realized that this tape might hold the answers she'd been searching for, the final piece that could break the hold of Candle Cove. Back in her motel room, Emma stared at the tape, feeling an almost magnetic pull toward it. She placed it into the old VCR she'd found in the room's closet, pressing play as she braced herself for what she was about to see. The screen flickered, filling the room with a harsh, crackling static. For a moment, it looked as though the tape had deteriorated beyond repair, the image distorted and fractured. But slowly, shapes began to form within the static, images flickering into view. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the familiar face of Pirate Percy appeared on the screen. His eyes were darker than she remembered, his smile wider, as though he were barely holding back a terrible secret. The eerie, discordant music of Candle Cove played softly in the background, its melody warped and unsettling. "Welcome back, children," Percy said, his voice softer than usual, almost a whisper. "Tonight's episode is special. Tonight, we're going somewhere new." The screen shifted, showing an old, decrepit house nestled in the woods, its windows dark and lifeless, the door slightly ajar. Emma's heart pounded as she recognized the house from her dreams. It was the same house where she had seen the ship, the same place where the children had disappeared. The camera cut back to Percy, who seemed to be looking directly at her, his hollow eyes filled with a cold, mocking glee. "Come join us, Emma," he whispered. "Come to the ship." Emma felt a chill settle over her as the camera panned out, showing the faces of the children she had seen in her dreams. Lucas, Sarah, James, all of them stood in a line, their faces blank, their eyes wide and unblinking. They seemed almost lifeless, their expressions devoid of emotion, as though they were sleepwalking through a nightmare. The children began to move, walking toward the house with slow, mechanical steps. The camera followed them, its lens shaking slightly as though held by an unseen hand. They entered the house, their movements stiff and unnatural, as though they were being controlled by some invisible force. Emma watched in horror as the camera followed them through the dark, empty halls, each step echoing through the silence. The children moved as one, their footsteps synchronized, their eyes fixed straight ahead. They seemed oblivious to their surroundings, their expressions blank, their faces pale and ghostly in the dim light. Suddenly the screen flickered, the image distorting as static filled the frame. When the image returned, the children were standing in a small dark room, their backs to the camera. They faced a single flickering candle that sat on the floor, its flame casting eerie shadows across their faces. Pirate Percy appeared behind them, his grin wider than ever, his eyes dark and empty. He placed a hand on each child's shoulder, his movements slow and deliberate, his touch lingering as though savoring the fear that radiated from them. "Tonight we're going on a journey," he whispered, his voice soft and chilling. "We're going to the other side." The children stood still, their expressions blank, their eyes fixed on the flame. They didn't move, didn't speak, didn't seem to register Percy's words. It was as though they were in a trance, caught between worlds, their minds trapped in a place where reality and nightmare intertwined. Emma's hands shook as she watched, her heart pounding as she realized what was happening. The children were being led into the liminal space, the realm that Colt had described in his notebooks. They were crossing over, stepping into a place where they could never return. The camera panned out, showing the entire room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, spirals and shapes that seemed to shift and twist in the flickering candlelight. Emma recognized them from the notebook she had read. Symbols of transition, of passage, of the thin veil that separated life from death. Pirate Percy stepped forward, his grin widening as he raised his hands, his voice filled with a dark, twisted joy. "Come, children," he whispered. "Come to the ship." The screen flickered, the image distorting as static filled the frame once more. When the image returned, the children were gone, the room empty, the candle flickering alone in the darkness. Emma felt a wave of terror wash over her as she realized what she had just witnessed. The children had been taken, their souls drawn into the darkness, bound to the ship that haunted her dreams. They were lost, trapped in a world where shadows held sway, where nightmares were real. She reached for the remote, her hands shaking as she tried to turn off the tape. But the image remained, the screen filling with static as Pirate Percy's face appeared once more, his hollow eyes fixed on her with a look of dark amusement. "Come to the ship, Emma," he whispered. "Come to the other side." Emma felt a surge of terror as Percy's words echoed through the room, the weight of his invitation pressing down on her like a physical force. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, the static growing louder, filling her ears with a relentless, piercing noise that seemed to claw at her mind. With a final burst of willpower, Emma pressed the power button, the screen going dark as the tape stopped. She sat there, her heart racing, her mind reeling as she tried to make sense of what she had just seen. But even as she tried to shake off the nightmare, she knew that she couldn't turn back. The children were calling to her, their voices lingering in her mind, their pleas filling her with a sense of desperation that she couldn't ignore. They were trapped, lost to a darkness that lay beyond the veil, a world where Pirate Percy and the Skin Taker held sway, where nightmares were real and escape was impossible. And Emma knew, deep down, that she was the only one who could bring them back. Determined to find answers, Emma spent the next few days digging deeper into Colt's life, hoping to uncover something, anything that could help her understand what she had seen. She combed through old records, interviewed anyone who had known him, piecing together a story that was darker than she could have imagined. Colt had been obsessed with the idea of liminality, the thin veil between worlds, the place where reality and nightmare merged. He believed that children were the key, that their innocence and imagination allowed them to see beyond the limits of the material world. He had created Candle Cove as a means of reaching that place, of crossing over into the darkness that lay beyond. But it wasn't just about the children. Colt had wanted to cross over himself, to join the world he had glimpsed through the veil, a place where he could wield ultimate power, where he could control the shadows and bend them to his will. Emma felt a chill settle over her as she realized the full scope of Colt's plan. He hadn't just created a show. He had created a gateway, a ritual designed to lure children into a world where he could manipulate them, where he could use their innocence to fuel his own twisted vision. And now, decades later, his creation still lingered. Chapter 8. Echoes from the Other Side. Emma's investigation into Candle Cove had brought her to the brink of something she could barely comprehend, an abyss that seemed to stare back at her, daring her to look deeper. The children trapped in the lost episode haunted her mind. Lucas, Sarah, James, all taken by a force she couldn't quite understand, their innocence twisted into fuel for David Colt's dark vision. Every night, she dreamed of the ship, of the fog rolling in as Pirate Percy and the Skin Taker waited on the deck, beckoning her to step across, to join them in the shadows. The echo of Percy's invitation stayed with her, a haunting refrain that replayed in her mind, dragging her closer to the mystery's heart. Emma knew she couldn't stop now. Something was drawing her forward, pushing her to confront the darkness Colt had unleashed. But one evening, after hours of combing through archives and Colt's notes, Emma returned to her motel room and found herself staring at the TV. She'd felt this pull before, this urge to tune into the forgotten channel. She was almost afraid to follow the impulse, but she needed answers. She felt the weight of the children's stares, their ghostly voices calling to her from somewhere beyond the veil. With trembling hands, she turned on the TV and began scrolling through the channels. Static filled the screen, crackling and pulsing, the sound somehow louder than usual, more alive. Emma felt her heart race as she turned the dial slowly, searching for the familiar flicker of something hidden within the noise. And then she saw it, a faint, shadowy image taking shape, barely visible within the static. She held her breath, her eyes fixed on the screen as the image grew clearer, revealing the outline of Pirate Percy's ship floating in a dark, endless sea. The fog swirled around it, thick and impenetrable, and shadows moved across the deck, their forms shifting and indistinct, like wraiths caught between worlds. Emma felt a chill run through her as she recognized the faces on the screen. The children were there, their hollow eyes staring back at her with a look of longing, of despair. Lucas, Sarah, James, all of them watched her from the other side, their expressions twisted into silent pleas for help. "Emma," a voice whispered from the screen, soft and chilling. "Come to the ship." It was Pirate Percy, his face barely visible within the shadows, his eyes dark and hollow. He reached out toward her, his hand extending from the screen as though he were trying to pull her into his world. "Come play with us, Emma," he whispered. "Come to the other side." Emma's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing as she felt the pull of his words, the magnetic force drawing her closer to the screen. She wanted to turn away, to escape the darkness that beckoned her, but something held her in place, a strange compulsion that she couldn't resist. The children's faces stared at her, their expressions filled with a desperation that pierced her heart. She could see the fear in their eyes, the silent terror that had taken hold of them, trapping them in a world where they could never return. With a final burst of courage, Emma tore her gaze away from the screen and reached for the remote, her hands shaking as she turned off the TV. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight of the static lifting as the screen went dark. But even as she sat there, her heart pounding, she could feel the lingering presence of the other side, the shadows that waited just beyond the veil, their dark, twisted forms pressing in around her. Determined to find a way to free the children, Emma returned to the library the next day. She was convinced that there must be something in Colt's work, some clue that would reveal how he had breached the veil between worlds. She combed through his notebooks, his sketches, searching for any detail that might provide a way to undo his work. In one of the oldest notebooks, she found a page that made her heart race. It was a rough sketch of the ship she had seen in her dreams, the same vessel that haunted the children's last moments in Candle Cove. Beneath the sketch, Colt had written a single chilling phrase: "The ship is the passage. To sever it is to free them." Emma's mind reeled as she read the words. If the ship was the key, then destroying it might be the only way to free the children from its hold. She knew it was a dangerous plan, but she had no other choice. She had to confront the darkness, to face Pirate Percy and the Skin Taker, to sever the connection that bound the children to the other side. On board that night, Emma returned to her motel room, her heart pounding as she prepared herself for what lay ahead. She knew that the only way to reach the ship was to tune into the Forgotten Channel, to follow the path Colt had created. She didn't know if she would be able to come back, but she was willing to take the risk. She turned on the TV, her hands trembling as she tuned into the static, the crackling noise filling the room as the screen flickered to life. The familiar image of the ship appeared, shrouded in fog, its dark silhouette drifting across the endless sea. Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself as she focused on the image, letting the static pull her in, letting the darkness wrap around her like a shroud. And then, in one horrifying moment, she felt herself slipping, her vision blurring as the world around her faded into darkness. The static grew louder, filling her ears with a relentless, piercing noise that seemed to claw at her mind, pulling her deeper into the void. When she opened her eyes, she was standing on the shore of a dark, desolate landscape, the air thick with fog and the scent of salt and decay. The sea stretched out before her, black and endless, its waves crashing against the rocks with a hollow, echoing sound. And there, drifting on the water, was the ship. Emma felt a surge of fear as she looked at the vessel, its tattered sails and decaying wood casting long shadows across the water. The ship seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its presence filling the air with a sense of dread so intense it left her breathless. She knew she had crossed over, that she was standing in the liminal space Colt had described, the place where nightmares became reality. The children's souls were here, bound to this twisted vessel, trapped in a world where shadows held sway. With a sense of grim determination, Emma made her way toward the ship, her footsteps echoing across the empty shore. She could feel the eyes of the children watching her, their ghostly forms flickering in the shadows, their faces filled with a longing that broke her heart. As she reached the edge of the water, she heard a soft, chilling melody drift through the air, the same haunting tune that had accompanied Pirate Percy's invitation. The notes were slow and discordant, each one filled with a sense of despair, of loss, as though the music itself were a cry for help. Emma took a deep breath and stepped into the water, her body cold and heavy as she waded toward the ship. The waves lapped at her legs, pulling her forward, guiding her to the vessel that waited just beyond the shore. As she climbed aboard, the melody grew louder, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. Shadows moved across the deck, their forms shifting and indistinct, like wraiths caught between worlds. She could feel their presence pressing in around her, their hollow eyes watching her with a hunger that sent a shiver through her soul. And then she saw him, Pirate Percy, standing at the helm, his grin wide and fixed, his eyes dark and empty. He watched her with a look of dark amusement, his gaze filled with a twisted joy that made her skin crawl. "Welcome, Emma," he whispered, his voice soft and mocking. "We've been waiting for you." Emma clenched her fists, her heart pounding as she faced him. "Let them go, Percy," she said, her voice shaking. "Let the children go." Percy's grin widened, his eyes glinting with a cold, malevolent light. "They belong to us now," he whispered. "They are part of the ship, part of the other side. You cannot free them, Emma. They are bound to this place, to the darkness that lies beyond the veil." Emma took a step forward, her hands trembling as she felt the weight of his words. "I won't let you keep them here," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I'll destroy this ship if I have to. I'll do whatever it takes to bring them back." Percy's expression darkened, his grin fading as he watched her with a look of cold, calculating malice. "You cannot destroy what is already dead, Emma. This ship exists beyond your world, beyond life and death. It is a vessel of shadows, a gateway to the other side. You are as much a part of it now as they are." Emma felt a surge of desperation as she realized the truth of his words. She was trapped, bound to the ship, caught in the same darkness that held the children captive, but she refused to give up. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Colt's notebook, the pages filled with his twisted notes and symbols. She flipped to the page with the sketch of the ship, her hands shaking as she read the words beneath it. "The ship is the passage. To sever it is to free them." With a surge of determination, Emma tore the page from the notebook and held it up, her voice filled with defiance. "This ship is your prison, Percy, and I'm going to break it." Percy's face twisted in anger, his hollow eyes narrowing as he took a step toward her. "You cannot sever what binds us, Emma. The ship is eternal. It is part of the darkness, part of the void. You are nothing but a flicker of light, a fragile flame that will be snuffed out." Emma ignored him, her focus fixed on the symbols in Colt's notebook. She began to trace them in the air, her hands moving with a strange instinctual knowledge, as though the symbols themselves were guiding her, showing her the way. As she drew the final symbol, a strange energy filled the air, the darkness around her trembling as though recoiling from her actions. The ship began to shudder, its wood creaking and groaning as cracks appeared along its hull, spreading like veins through the decaying structure. The shadows on the deck twisted and writhed, their forms dissolving as the ship began to break apart, the darkness peeling away like layers of old, rotting paint. Emma felt the weight of the children's eyes on her, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence as the ship began to collapse, the void around them shrinking, pulling them back toward the light. Percy let out a furious scream, his hollow eyes blazing with rage as he lunged at her, his hands reaching for her throat. But Emma stood her ground, her focus unbroken as she completed the final symbol, her voice filled with a quiet, unwavering strength. "Begone, Percy," she whispered. "Return to the darkness where you belong." With a final agonized scream, Percy dissolved into shadows, his form dissipating as the ship crumbled around them, the void collapsing in on itself, pulling him back into the darkness from which he had come. Emma felt a surge of relief as the ship disappeared, the weight of the darkness lifting as the children's faces flickered one last time, their expressions filled with a sense of peace, of gratitude, as they faded into the light. And then, in a rush of blinding white, the world around her vanished, and she found herself standing on the shore once more, the fog lifting, the sea calm and empty. The ship was gone, the shadows banished, the children free. Emma took a deep breath, the weight of their souls lifting from her heart as she turned and walked away, the echoes of their voices fading into the distance, a quiet reminder of the darkness she had overcome. And as she stepped back into the light, she knew that she had finally severed the ties that bound Candle Cove to this world, freeing the children from the darkness that had held them captive. The nightmare was over. Chapter 9. The Final Broadcast. Emma felt as though she'd been running on borrowed time ever since she severed the children's ties to Candle Cove, setting their souls free from David Colt's dark legacy. The haunting images of Pirate Percy, the eerie skin taker, and the cursed ship still lingered at the edges of her mind, like ghostly apparitions fading in and out of view. She had returned from that twisted world bruised but alive, her body back in Ironton, but her mind haunted by a presence that seemed unwilling to release her completely. Now, she felt Colt's lingering influence stronger than ever. She had freed the children, but the darkness had not dissipated. There was still a gnawing sense of incompletion, an unsettling intuition that Candle Cove had not been truly destroyed. Colt's creation, his ritual, seemed to pulse in her memories, as if demanding her attention, daring her to face the heart of its curse one final time. And that evening, a heavy storm gathered over Ironton. Thunder rolled through the sky as thick, dark clouds churned, casting the town into a premature dusk. The weather seemed to mirror Emma's thoughts, turbulent and brooding. She found herself in her motel room, Colt's notebook resting on her lap, its pages covered in notes, symbols, and half-coherent phrases that hinted at his dark philosophy. The storm outside intensified, the rain lashing against the window in relentless sheets, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, some unseen force gathering energy. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, the hour when Candle Cove had always seemed to draw its viewers in, the time when the forgotten channel was most likely to flicker into existence. Her mind began to drift as she recalled Colt's words on one of the final pages of his journal. The show must end where it began. The phrase had haunted her since she'd first read it, its meaning elusive, taunting her. The show had been born in Ironton, but where exactly had it begun? And how could she truly end something that seemed to defy the boundaries of reality itself? She flipped to another page, one covered in crude sketches of children's faces with hollow eyes, their mouths twisted into silent screams. Beneath the drawings, Colt had scrawled an ominous phrase, "The broadcast is eternal." It echoes through the static. The words sent a chill through her. Colt believed that Candle Cove was more than a show. It was an entity, a living presence embedded in the very fabric of the airwaves, slipping through the spaces between perception, an echo that could not be silenced. Emma knew then that there was only one place left for her to go. She needed to confront Candle Cove at its source. Armed with nothing but Colt's notebook and her resolve, Emma braved the storm and drove to the outskirts of town, where the old broadcast tower still loomed like a skeletal sentinel against the night sky. The tower had been abandoned for decades, yet it felt alive with an unholy energy, as though the structure itself were aware of her presence, its metal frame creaking in the wind, its silhouette barely visible in the sheets of rain. The wind howled as Emma approached the building at the tower's base, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the crumbling walls and rusted door. The sense of dread was almost overwhelming, but she pushed it aside, steeling herself as she opened the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of mold and rust, a metallic tang that stung her nostrils as she made her way down the narrow hallway toward the control room. Each step echoed through the empty building, the sound distorted by the storm outside, making it feel as though something, or someone, were moving in the darkness, following her. At last, she reached the control room, the heart of the tower. Old, rusted equipment lined the walls, covered in a layer of dust that had settled over decades of abandonment. But the room was not silent. A faint hum filled the air, a subtle vibration that made her skin prickle. She approached the console, her hands trembling as she ran her fingers over the switches and dials. This was the equipment Colt had used to broadcast Candle Cove, the machines that had brought his dark vision to life. She could feel the remnants of his presence in the room, an invisible stain that seemed to cling to the walls, filling the air with a sense of malice. Her gaze fell on an old television set in the corner of the room, its screen coated in a layer of dust, the glass cracked and grimy. She wiped it clean, revealing the faint outline of her reflection in the glass. For a moment, she saw only her own face, pale and drawn, her eyes filled with determination. But as she stared into the screen, her reflection seemed to shift, her features warping and twisting until she was staring into the hollow, grinning face of Pirate Percy. "Welcome back, Emma," he whispered, his voice soft and mocking. "Did you think you could escape us?" Emma's heart pounded as Percy's voice echoed through the room, filling the air with a cold, mocking laughter. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for Colt's notebook, her fingers brushing over the pages as though seeking guidance. She flipped to the final page, where Colt had scrawled a series of symbols, strange, interlocking shapes that seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their lines twisting and contorting as though alive. These were the symbols he had used to bind Candle Cove to the airwaves, to fuse the show with the static, creating a broadcast that could never truly be silenced. Emma traced the symbols with her fingers, her mind racing as she realized what she had to do. She would have to turn Colt's ritual against him, using the symbols to sever the connection he had created, to break the broadcast's hold on this world. But as she reached for the power dial, ready to begin the process, she felt a surge of resistance, a force pushing back against her, as though the tower itself were alive, fighting to maintain its hold on the broadcast. "You cannot stop me, Emma," Colt's voice echoed through the static, his tone filled with a quiet, unyielding malice. "I am the signal. I am the darkness that lives in the spaces between." Emma clenched her fists, her fear melting away as she faced Colt's presence, her resolve hardening. "Your show is over, Colt," she said, her voice steady and filled with a fierce determination. "I'm ending it once and for all." The screen flickered, the static intensifying as Colt's face twisted into a look of rage, his hollow eyes burning with fury. "You are nothing, Emma," he hissed. "You are a mere flicker of light in the endless void. I am eternal. I am the darkness that cannot be severed." But Emma ignored his words, her focus unbroken as she began to trace the symbols on the console, her hands moving with a strange, instinctual knowledge, as though she were following some unseen force. Each line, each curve, seemed to resonate with a power that filled the air, the symbols glowing faintly as she completed the ritual. The static grew louder, filling the room with a deafening roar, the screen flickering as Colt's face distorted, his form dissolving into shadows that writhed and twisted within the noise. "You cannot sever me!" he screamed, his voice filled with fury, his hollow eyes blazing as he reached out toward her, his hands pressing against the glass as though trying to break through, to pull her into the darkness that lay beyond. But Emma's focus remained unbroken, her hands steady as she completed the final symbol, her voice ringing through the room as she spoke the words Colt had written, the phrase that would sever the connection, ending the broadcast once and for all. "With this mark, I banish you to the darkness. The show is over." The static reached a fever pitch, the noise filling every corner of the room, pressing down on her like a physical weight. The screen shattered, the glass splintering as Colt's face dissolved into darkness, his twisted grin fading into the void, his presence disappearing as the static faded, leaving only silence. The room was quiet, the oppressive weight lifting as the connection was severed, the broadcast finally silenced. Emma took a deep breath, her body trembling as she felt the darkness dissipate, the hold of Candle Cove broken. But as she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered, a faint echo of Colt's presence, a shadow that remained in the spaces between, waiting, watching. The storm had subsided by the time Emma stepped outside, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the town. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had done what she could, that she had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Yet, as she drove away from Ironton, the memory of Candle Cove remained with her, a ghostly whisper at the edges of her mind, a reminder that some nightmares never truly fade, that some shadows linger, waiting in the static, biding their time. Chapter 10. Shadows in the Static. Days passed since Emma severed the last tie between Candle Cove and the world of the living. The nightmares had eased, and she felt a newfound peace knowing that the lost children were free. Yet as much as she tried to put Ironton behind her, the experience left an indelible mark. Every night she would lie in bed, half expecting to hear the faint sound of static or a whispering voice calling her name. Her dreams were no longer plagued by Pirate Percy or the Skin Taker, yet shadows still lingered at the edges of her vision, like faded memories waiting to resurface. Emma decided it was time to leave Ironton. She packed her belongings, preparing for the long drive back, feeling as though the town itself was watching her. The old, forgotten secrets still woven into the quiet streets and empty fields. But just as she was about to leave, her phone buzzed. The number was unlisted, the screen simply reading, "Private." With a sense of foreboding, she answered. "Emma," a child's voice whispered on the other end. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was familiar, achingly so. Lucas, one of the children she had freed. "Lucas," she whispered, her heart pounding. "Is that you?" "We're free, Emma," Lucas replied, his voice soft and distant. "But there's something else. Someone else. He's still here." A chill settled over her as she listened, the silence on the other end growing heavy, oppressive. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "David Colt," Lucas replied, his voice dropping to a fearful hush. "He's waiting." Before Emma could respond, the line went dead, the silence leaving a hollow echo in her mind. She sat there, the phone clutched in her hand, a new dread settling over her as she realized the truth. She had freed the children, but David Colt, the man who had created Candle Cove, who had brought this darkness into the world, was still out there, his influence lingering like a shadow, waiting for the right moment to return. Emma knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. The next morning, Emma returned to the old broadcast tower, the place where Colt had sent his final transmission. The structure loomed before her, silent and abandoned, yet filled with an energy that seemed to hum in the air, as though the tower itself were alive. She climbed the narrow staircase to the control room, each step echoing through the empty space, her heart pounding as she felt Colt's presence pressing down on her, an unseen force watching her every move. The control room was just as she had left it, the shattered TV screen lying on the floor, its glass glittering in the dim light. Emma stepped closer, her gaze falling on the remnants of the screen, and for a moment, she saw her own reflection in the broken glass, her face pale, her eyes hollow. But as she stared, her reflection seemed to shift, her features warping, twisting until she was staring into the eyes of David Colt. "Hello, Emma," he whispered, his voice soft and mocking. "Welcome back." Emma stumbled back, her heart racing as Colt's image flickered in the shards of glass. His face twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes dark and empty. "You thought you could stop me, didn't you?" he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet malice. "But you can't sever what isn't whole. I am the static, the signal, the darkness that lives in the spaces between." Emma felt a surge of anger, her fear melting away as she stood her ground, her gaze fixed on the shattered screen. "I won't let you hurt anyone else, Colt," she said, her voice steady, filled with a fierce determination. "Your show is over." Colt's laughter echoed through the room, a dark, twisted sound that filled the air, pressing down on her like a physical weight. "The show never ends, Emma," he whispered, his voice filled with a cold, mocking amusement. "It simply waits, biding its time, slipping through the cracks, finding new minds to shape, new eyes to see." Emma took a deep breath, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way to break Colt's hold once and for all. She knew that the TV had been his connection to the other side, the channel through which he had drawn children into his twisted world. But if she could destroy that link, sever the signal for good, she might be able to end his influence once and for all. She looked around the control room, her gaze falling on a dusty console filled with knobs and switches. She remembered the equipment from her last visit, how it had hummed with a faint pulsing energy, as though it were still connected to something beyond her understanding. Taking a deep breath, Emma began flipping switches, pressing buttons, her hands moving with a strange, instinctual knowledge, as though she were following some unseen force. The console hummed to life, the old machinery creaking and groaning as the lights flickered on, casting an eerie glow across the room. Emma felt a surge of energy radiate from the console, filling the air with a static charge that prickled her skin, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The screen on the wall flickered to life, filling with static, the familiar crackling sound echoing through the room. And then, within the noise, she saw him, David Colt, his face twisted into a grotesque grin, his hollow eyes staring back at her with a look of dark amusement. "You cannot stop me, Emma," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet, unyielding malice. "I am the signal. I am the void. I am the darkness that lives in the spaces between." Emma felt a surge of anger, her fear melting away as she faced him, her mind filled with a fierce determination. She reached for the power dial, her fingers trembling as she turned it, increasing the signal, the static growing louder, filling the room with a deafening roar. Colt's face twisted, his expression contorting with rage as the signal grew stronger, the static overwhelming him, distorting his features until he was little more than a dark, shapeless form within the noise. "No!" he screamed, his voice filled with fury. "You cannot sever me! I am eternal! I am the darkness!" But Emma's focus remained unbroken, her hands steady as she turned the dial to its highest setting, the static reaching a fever pitch, drowning out Colt's voice, his form dissolving into shadows, his presence fading as the screen flickered and went dark. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, the air thick with the weight of Colt's absence. Emma took a deep breath, her body trembling as she felt the energy dissipate, the darkness lifting as the room fell into a quiet, still calm. But as she stood there, the sense of relief fading, she couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered, a faint echoing presence that remained in the static, a whisper that drifted through the silence, like a ghostly reminder of the nightmare she had faced. "Emma!" The voice was faint, barely audible, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She knew Colt was gone, his connection severed, his hold broken. But the memory of him, the shadow of his influence would remain, lingering in the spaces between, a dark reminder of the horrors that lay beyond the veil. Emma left the tower, the weight of her journey pressing down on her, the memory of Candle Cove etched into her mind like a scar. She knew that she would carry the experience with her, a reminder of the darkness she had faced, the children she had freed, the battle she had fought. But as she made her way back to her car, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, she felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had done what she could, that she had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Months passed, and Emma returned to her life, the experience in Ironton fading into the background, like a distant, haunting memory. She went back to her work, her routine, but the scars remained, a quiet reminder of the shadows she had faced. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, the hum of the television filling the room, she felt a strange sense of unease, a feeling that something was watching her. She glanced at the TV, the screen filled with static, the familiar crackling noise echoing through the room. For a moment, she thought she saw a face within the static, a shadowy figure watching her, its hollow eyes fixed on her with a look of dark amusement. But as she blinked, the image faded, leaving only the empty screen, the faint, lingering hum of the static. Emma took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she turned off the TV, the room falling into silence, the darkness pressing in around her. And in that silence she heard a whisper, soft and chilling, a voice that sent a shiver down her spine. "The show never ends, Emma." She closed her eyes, the weight of the words settling over her, the realization that some nightmares never truly fade, that some shadows linger, waiting in the spaces between, ready to return. As she sat alone in the dark, Emma knew that Candle Cove would remain with her, a ghostly presence that would haunt her, a reminder of the darkness that lay just beyond the veil, waiting, watching, biding its time. The show would go on, forever hidden, forever waiting in the static.